Chapter 4 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 4. Through tops of the high trees she did descry a little smoke, whose vapour, thin and light, reeking aloft, uprolled to the sky, which cheerful sign did send unto her sight, that in the same did one some living wight. Spenser. Lucy acted as her father's guide, for he was too much engrossed with his political labours, or with society, to be perfectly acquainted with his own extensive domains, and, moreover, was generally an inhabitant of the city of Edinburgh, and she, on the other hand, had with her mother resided the whole summer in Ravenswood, and partly from taste, partly from want of any other amusement, had, by her frequent rambles, learned to know each lane, alley, dingle, or bushy dell, and every bosky burn from side to side. We have said that the Lord Keeper was not indifferent to the beauties of nature, and we add, in justice to him, that he felt them doubly when pointed out by the beautiful, simple, and interesting girl who, hanging on his arm with filial kindness, now called him to admire the size of some ancient oak, and now the unexpected turn where the path, developing its maze from glen or dingle, suddenly reached an eminence commanding an extensive view of the plains beneath them, and then gradually glided away from the prospect to lose itself among rocks and thickets, and guide to scenes of deeper seclusion. It was when pausing on one of those points of extensive and commanding view that Lucy told her father they were close by the cottage of her blind protégée, and on turning from the little hill, a path which led around it, worn by the daily steps of the infirm inmate, brought them in sight of the hut, which, embosomed in a deep and obscure dell, seemed to have been so situated purposely to bear correspondence with the darkened state of its inhabitant. The cottage was situated immediately under a tall rock, which in some measure beetled over it, as if threatening to drop some detached fragment from its brow on the frail tenement beneath. The hut itself was constructed of turf and stones, and rudely roofed over with thatch, much of which was in a dilapidated condition. The thin blue smoke rose from it in a light column, and curled upward along the white face of the incumbent rock, giving the scene a tint of exquisite softness. In a small and rude garden, surrounded by straggling elder bushes, which formed a sort of imperfect hedge, sat near to the beehives, by the produce of which she lived, that woman old, whom Lucy had brought her father hither to visit. Whatever there had been which was disastrous in her fortune, whatever there was miserable in her dwelling, it was easy to judge by the first glance that neither years, poverty, misfortune, nor infirmity had broken the spirit of this remarkable woman. She occupied a turf seat, placed under a weeping birch of unusual magnitude and age, as Judah is represented sitting under her palm tree, with an air at once of majesty and of dejection. Her figure was tall, commanding, and but little bent by the infirmities of old age. Her dress, though that of a peasant, was uncommonly clean, forming in that particular a strong contrast to most of her rank, and was disposed with an attention to neatness, and even to taste, equally unusual. But it was her expression of countenance which chiefly struck the spectator, and induced most persons to address her with a degree of deference and civility very inconsistent with the miserable state of her dwelling, and which, nevertheless, she received with that easy composure which showed she felt it to be her due. She had once been beautiful, but her beauty had been of a bold and masculine cast, such as does not survive the bloom of youth. Yet her features continued to express strong sense, deep reflection, and a character of sober pride, which, as we have already said of her dress, appeared to argue a conscious superiority to those of her own rank. It scarce seemed possible that a face deprived of the advantage of sight could have expressed character so strongly, but her eyes, which were almost totally closed, did not, by the display of their sightless orbs, mar the countenance to which they could add nothing. She seemed in a ruminating posture, soothed perhaps by the murmurs of the busy tribe around her to abstraction, though not to slumber. Lucy undid the latch of the little garden gate and solicited the old woman's attention. "My father, Alice, is come to see you." "He is welcome, Miss Ashton, and so are you," said the old woman, turning and inclining her head towards the visitors. "This is a fine morning for your beehives, mother," said the Lord Keeper, who, struck with the outward appearance of Alice, was somewhat curious to know if her conversation would correspond with it. "I believe so, my lord," she replied. "I feel the air breathe milder than of late." "You do not," resumed the statesman, "take charge of the bees yourself, mother. How do you manage them?" "By delegates, as kings do their subjects," resumed Alice, "and I am fortunate in a prime minister. Here, baby." She whistled on a small silver call which hung around her neck, and which at that time was sometimes used to summon domestics, and baby, a girl of 15, made her appearance from the hut, not altogether so cleanly arrayed as she would probably have been had Alice had the use of her eyes, but with a greater air of neatness than was upon the whole to have been expected. "Baby," said her mistress, "offer some bread and honey to the Lord Keeper and Miss Ashton. They will excuse your awkwardness if you use cleanliness and dispatch." Baby performed her mistress's command with the grace which was naturally to have been expected, moving to and fro with a lobster-like gesture, her feet and legs tending one way, while her head, turned in a different direction, was fixed in wonder upon the laird, who was more frequently heard of than seen by his tenants and dependants. The bread and honey, however, deposited on a plantain leaf, was offered and accepted in all due courtesy. The Lord Keeper, still retaining the place which he had occupied on the decayed trunk of a fallen tree, looked as if he wished to prolong the interview, but was at a loss how to introduce a suitable subject. "You have been long a resident on this property?" he said after a pause. "It is now nearly 60 years since I first knew Ravenswood," answered the old dame, whose conversation, though perfectly civil and respectful, seemed cautiously limited to the unavoidable and necessary task of replying to Sir William. "You are not, I should judge by your accent, of this country originally," said the Lord Keeper in continuation. "No, I am by birth an Englishwoman." "Yet you seem attached to this country as if it were your own." "It is here," replied the blind woman, "that I have drank the cup of joy and of sorrow which Heaven destined for me. I was here the wife of an upright and affectionate husband for more than 20 years. I was here the mother of 6 promising children. It was here that God deprived me of all these blessings. It was here they died, and yonder by yon ruined chapel they lie all buried. I had no country but theirs while they lived. I have none but theirs now they are no more." "But your house," said the Lord Keeper, looking at it, "is miserably ruinous." "Do, my dear father," said Lucy eagerly yet bashfully, catching at the hint, "give orders to make it better, that is, if you think it proper." "It will last my time, my dear Miss Lucy," said the blind woman. "I would not have my lord give himself the least trouble about it." "But," said Lucy, "you once had a much better house, and were rich, and now in your old age to live in this hovel." "It is as good as I deserve, Miss Lucy. If my heart has not broke with what I have suffered, and seen others suffer, it must have been strong enough, and the rest of this old frame has no right to call itself weaker." "You have probably witnessed many changes," said the Lord Keeper, "but your experience must have taught you to expect them." "It has taught me to endure them, my lord," was the reply. "Yet you knew that they must needs arrive in the course of years," said the statesman. "Ay, as I knew that the stump, on or beside which you sit, once a tall and lofty tree, must needs one day fall by decay, or by the axe. Yet I hoped my eyes might not witness the downfall of the tree which overshadowed my dwelling." "Do not suppose," said the Lord Keeper, that you will lose any interest with me for looking back with regret to the days when another family possessed my estates. You had reason, doubtless, to love them, and I respect your gratitude. I will order some repairs in your cottage, and I hope we shall live to be friends when we know each other better." "Those of my age," returned the dame, "make no new friends. I thank you for your bounty, it is well intended, undoubtedly, but I have all I want, and I cannot accept more at your lordship's hand." "Well, then," continued the Lord Keeper, "at least allow me to say that I look upon you as a woman of sense and education beyond your appearance, and that I hope you will continue to reside on this property of mine rent-free for your life." "I hope I shall," said the old dame composedly. "I believe that was made an article in the sale of Ravenswood to your lordship, though such a trifling circumstance may have escaped your recollection." "I remember, I recollect," said his lordship, somewhat confused. "I perceive you are too much attached to your old friends to accept any benefit from their successor." "Far from it, my lord. I am grateful for the benefits which I decline, and I wish I could pay you for offering them, better than what I am now about to say." The Lord Keeper looked at her in some surprise, but said not a word. "My lord," she continued, in an impressive and solemn tone, "take care what you do. You are on the brink of a precipice." "Indeed?" said the Lord Keeper, his mind reverting to the political circumstances of the country. "Has anything come to your knowledge, any plot or conspiracy?" "No, my lord. Those who traffic in such commodities do not call to their counsels the old, blind, and infirm. My warning is of another kind. You have driven matters hard with the house of Ravenswood. Believe a true tale. They are a fierce house, and there is danger in dealing with men when they become desperate." "Tush!" answered the Keeper. "What has been between us has been the work of the law, not my doing, and to the law they must look if they would impugn my proceedings." "Ay, but they may think otherwise, and take the law into their own hand when they fail of other means of redress." "What mean you?" said the Lord Keeper. "Young Ravenswood would not have recourse to personal violence." "God forbid I should say so. I know nothing of the youth but what is honourable and open." "Honourable and open, said I? I should have added free, generous, noble. But he is still a Ravenswood, and may bide his time. Remember the fate of Sir George Lockhart." The Lord Keeper started as she called to his recollection a tragedy so deep and so recent. The old woman proceeded. "Chiesley, who did the deed, was a relative of Lord Ravenswood. In the hall of Ravenswood, in my presence, and in that of others, he avowed publicly his determination to do the cruelty which he afterwards committed. I could not keep silence, though to speak it ill became my station. 'You are devising a dreadful crime,' I said, 'for which you must reckon before the judgment seat.' Never shall I forget his look as he replied, 'I must reckon then for many things, and will reckon for this also.' Therefore, I may well say, beware of pressing a desperate man with the hand of authority. There is blood of Chiesley in the veins of Ravenswood, and one drop of it were enough to fire him in the circumstances in which he is placed. I say, beware of him." The old dame had, either intentionally or by accident, harped aright the fear of the Lord Keeper. The desperate and dark resource of private assassination, so familiar to a Scottish baron in former times, had even in the present age been too frequently resorted to under the pressure of unusual temptation, or where the mind of the actor was prepared for such a crime. Sir William Ashton was aware of this, as also that young Ravenswood had received injuries sufficient to prompt him to that sort of revenge, which becomes a frequent though fearful consequence of the partial administration of justice. He endeavoured to disguise from Alice the nature of the apprehensions which he entertained, but so ineffectually that a person even of less penetration than nature had endowed her with must necessarily have been aware that the subject lay near his bosom. His voice was changed in its accent as he replied to her, "That the Master of Ravenswood was a man of honour, and were it otherwise, that the fate of Chiesley of Dalry was a sufficient warning to any one who should dare to assume the office of avenger of his own imaginary wrongs." And having hastily uttered these expressions, he rose and left the place, without waiting for a reply. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 5. Is she a Capulet? O dear account, my life is my foe's debt. Shakespeare. The Lord Keeper walked for nearly a quarter of a mile in profound silence. His daughter, naturally timid, and bred up in those ideas of filial awe and implicit obedience which were inculcated upon the youth of that period, did not venture to interrupt his meditations. "Why do you look so pale, Lucy?" said her father, turning suddenly round and breaking silence. According to the ideas of the time, which did not permit a young woman to offer her sentiments on any subject of importance unless required to do so, Lucy was bound to appear ignorant of the meaning of all that had passed betwixt Alice and her father, and imputed the emotion he had observed to the fear of the wild cattle which grazed in that part of the extensive chase through which they were now walking. Of these animals, the descendants of the savage herds which anciently roamed free in the Caledonian forests, it was formerly a point of state to preserve a few in the parks of the Scottish nobility. Specimens continued within the memory of man to be kept at least at 3 houses of distinction, Hamilton namely, Drumlanrig, and Cumbernauld. They had degenerated from the ancient race in size and strength, if we are to judge from the accounts of old chronicles, and from the formidable remains frequently discovered in bogs and morasses when drained and laid open. The bull had lost the shaggy honours of his mane, and the race was small and light made, in colour a dingy white, or rather a pale yellow, with black horns and hoofs. They retained, however, in some measure the ferocity of their ancestry, could not be domesticated on account of their antipathy to the human race, and were often dangerous if approached unguardedly, or wantonly disturbed. It was this last reason which has occasioned their being extirpated at the places we have mentioned, where probably they would otherwise have been retained as appropriate inhabitants of a Scottish woodland, and fit tenants for a baronial forest. A few, if I mistake not, are still preserved at Chillingham Castle, in Northumberland, the seat of the Earl of Tankerville. It was to her finding herself in the vicinity of a group of 3 or 4 of these animals that Lucy thought proper to impute those signs of fear which had arisen in her countenance for a different reason. For she had been familiarized with the appearance of the wild cattle during her walks in the chase, and it was not then, as it may be now, a necessary part of a young lady's demeanour to indulge in causeless tremors of the nerves. On the present occasion, however, she speedily found cause for real terror. Lucy had scarcely replied to her father in the words we have mentioned, and he was just about to rebuke her supposed timidity, when a bull, stimulated either by the scarlet colour of Miss Ashton's mantle, or by one of those fits of capricious ferocity to which their dispositions are liable, detached himself suddenly from the group which was feeding at the upper extremity of a grassy glade, that seemed to lose itself among the crossing and entangled boughs. The animal approached the intruders on his pasture ground, at first slowly, pawing the ground with his hoof, bellowing from time to time, and tearing up the sand with his horns, as if to lash himself up to rage and violence. The Lord Keeper, who observed the animal's demeanour, was aware that he was about to become mischievous, and, drawing his daughter's arm under his own, began to walk fast along the avenue, in hopes to get out of his sight and his reach. This was the most injudicious course he could have adopted, for, encouraged by the appearance of flight, the bull began to pursue them at full speed. assailed by a danger so imminent, firmer courage than that of the Lord Keeper might have given way. But paternal tenderness, love strong as death, sustained him. He continued to support and drag onward his daughter, until her fears altogether depriving her of the power of flight, she sunk down by his side, and when he could no longer assist her to escape, he turned round and placed himself betwixt her and the raging animal, which, advancing in full career, its brutal fury enhanced by the rapidity of the pursuit, was now within a few yards of them. The Lord Keeper had no weapons. His age and gravity dispensed even with the usual appendage of a walking sword, could such appendage have availed him anything. It seemed inevitable that the father or daughter, or both, should have fallen victims to the impending danger, when a shot from the neighbouring thicket arrested the progress of the animal. He was so truly struck between the junction of the spine with the skull, that the wound, which in any other part of his body might scarce have impeded his career, proved instantly fatal. Stumbling forward with a hideous bellow, the progressive force of his previous motion, rather than any operation of his limbs, carried him up to within 3 yards of the astonished Lord Keeper, where he rolled on the ground, his limbs darkened with the black death sweat, and quivering with the last convulsions of muscular motion. Lucy lay senseless on the ground, insensible of the wonderful deliverance which she had experienced. Her father was almost equally stupefied. So rapid and unexpected had been the transition from the horrid death, which seemed inevitable, to perfect security. He gazed on the animal, terrible even in death, with a species of mute and confused astonishment, which did not permit him distinctly to understand what had taken place. And so inaccurate was his consciousness of what had passed, that he might have supposed the bull had been arrested in its career by a thunderbolt, had he not observed among the branches of the thicket the figure of a man with a short gun or musketoon in his hand. This instantly recalled him to a sense of their situation. A glance at his daughter reminded him of the necessity of procuring her assistance. He called to the man, whom he concluded to be one of his foresters, to give immediate attention to Miss Ashton, while he himself hastened to call assistance. The huntsman approached them accordingly, and the Lord Keeper saw he was a stranger, but was too much agitated to make any further remarks. In a few hurried words he directed the shooter, as stronger and more active than himself, to carry the young lady to a neighbouring fountain, while he went back to Alice's hut to procure more aid. The man to whose timely interference they had been so much indebted did not seem inclined to leave his good work half finished. He raised Lucy from the ground in his arms, and conveying her through the glades of the forest by paths with which he seemed well acquainted, stopped not until he laid her in safety by the side of a plentiful and pellucid fountain, which had been once covered in, screened, and decorated with architectural ornaments of a Gothic character. But now the vault which had covered it being broken down and riven, and the Gothic font ruined and demolished, the stream burst forth from the recess of the earth in open day, and winded its way among the broken sculpture and moss-grown stones which lay in confusion around its source. Tradition, always busy, at least in Scotland, to grace with a legendary tale a spot in itself interesting, had ascribed a cause of peculiar veneration to this fountain. A beautiful young lady met one of the lords of Ravenswood while hunting near this spot, and, like a second Egeria, had captivated the affections of the feudal Numa. They met frequently afterwards, and always at sunset, the charms of the nymph's mind completing the conquest which her beauty had begun, and the mystery of the intrigue adding zest to both. She always appeared and disappeared close by the fountain, with which, therefore, her lover judged she had some inexplicable connection. She placed certain restrictions on their intercourse, which also savoured of mystery. They met only once a week, Friday was the appointed day, and she explained to the Lord of Ravenswood that they were under the necessity of separating so soon as the bell of a chapel, belonging to a hermitage in the adjoining wood, now long ruinous, should toll the hour of vespers. In the course of his confession, the Baron of Ravenswood entrusted the hermit with the secret of this singular armour, and Father Zachary drew the necessary and obvious consequence, that his patron was enveloped in the toils of Satan, and in danger of destruction, both to body and soul. He urged these perils to the Baron with all the force of monkish rhetoric, and described in the most frightful colours the real character and person of the apparently lovely Naiad, whom he hesitated not to denounce as a limb of the kingdom of darkness. The lover listened with obstinate incredulity, and it was not until worn out by the obstinacy of the anchoret that he consented to put the state and condition of his mistress to a certain trial, and for that purpose acquiesced in Zachary's proposal, that on their next interview the vespers bell should be rung half an hour later than usual. The hermit maintained and bucklered his opinion by quotations from Malleus Maleficarum, Sprengerus, Remigius, and other learned demonologists, that the evil one, thus seduced to remain behind the appointed hour, would assume her true shape, and, having appeared to her terrified lover as a fiend of hell, would vanish from him in a flash of sulphurous lightning. Raymond of Ravenswood acquiesced in the experiment, not incurious concerning the issue, though confident it would disappoint the expectations of the hermit. At the appointed hour the lovers met, and their interview was protracted beyond that at which they usually parted, by the delay of the priest to ring his usual curfew. No change took place upon the nymph's outward form, but as soon as the lengthening shadows made her aware that the usual hour of the vespers chime was past, she tore herself from her lover's arms with a shriek of despair, bid him adieu for ever, and, plunging into the fountain, disappeared from his eyes. The bubbles occasioned by her descent were crimsoned with blood as they arose, leading the distracted Baron to infer that his ill-judged curiosity had occasioned the death of this interesting and mysterious being. The remorse which he felt, as well as the recollection of her charms, proved the penance of his future life, which he lost in the Battle of Flodden not many months after. But in memory of his Naiad he had previously ornamented the fountain in which she appeared to reside, and secured its waters from profanation or pollution by the small vaulted building of which the fragments still remained scattered around it. From this period the house of Ravenswood was supposed to have dated its decay. Such was the generally received legend, which some, who would seem wiser than the vulgar, explained as obscurely intimating the fate of a beautiful maid of plebeian rank, the mistress of this Raymond, whom he slew in a fit of jealousy, and whose blood was mingled with the waters of the locked fountain, as it was commonly called. Others imagined that the tale had a more remote origin in the ancient heathen mythology. All, however, agreed that the spot was fatal to the Ravenswood family, and that to drink of the waters of the well, or even approach its brink, was as ominous to a descendant of that house as for a Graham to wear green, a Bruce to kill a spider, or a St. Clair to cross the Ord on a Monday. It was on this ominous spot that Lucy Ashton first drew breath after her long and almost deadly swoon. Beautiful and pale as the fabulous Naiad in the last agony of separation from her lover, she was seated so as to rest with her back against a part of the ruined wall, while her mantle, dripping with the water which her protector had used profusely to recall her senses, clung to her slender and beautifully proportioned form. The first moment of recollection brought to her mind the danger which had overpowered her senses. The next called to remembrance that of her father. She looked around. He was nowhere to be seen. "My father! My father!" was all that she could ejaculate. "Sir William is safe," answered the voice of a stranger, "perfectly safe, and will be with you instantly." "Are you sure of that?" exclaimed Lucy. "The bull was close by us. Do not stop me. I must go to seek my father." And she rose with that purpose. But her strength was so much exhausted that, far from possessing the power to execute her purpose, she must have fallen against the stone on which she had leant, probably not without sustaining serious injury. The stranger was so near to her that, without actually suffering her to fall, he could not avoid catching her in his arms, which, however, he did with a momentary reluctance, very unusual when youth interposes to prevent beauty from danger. It seemed as if her weight, slight as it was, proved too heavy for her young and athletic assistant, for without feeling the temptation of detaining her in his arms, even for a single instant, he again placed her on the stone from which she had risen, and retreating a few steps, repeated hastily, "Sir William Ashton is perfectly safe, and will be here instantly. Do not make yourself anxious on his account. Fate has singularly preserved him. You, madam, are exhausted, and must not think of rising until you have some assistance more suitable than mine." Lucy, whose senses were by this time more effectually collected, was naturally led to look at the stranger with attention. There was nothing in his appearance which should have rendered him unwilling to offer his arm to a young lady who required support, or which could have induced her to refuse his assistance, and she could not help thinking, even in that moment, that he seemed cold and reluctant to offer it. A shooting dress of dark cloth intimated the rank of the wearer, though concealed in part by a large and loose cloak of a dark brown colour. A Montero cap and a black feather drooped over the wearer's brow, and partly concealed his features, which, so far as seen, were dark, regular, and full of majestic, though somewhat sullen, expression. Some secret sorrow, or the brooding spirit of some moody passion, had quenched the light and ingenuous vivacity of youth in a countenance singularly fitted to display both, and it was not easy to gaze upon the stranger without a secret impression either of pity or awe, or at least of doubt and curiosity allied to both. The impression which we have necessarily been long in describing, Lucy felt in the glance of a moment, and had no sooner encountered the keen black eyes of the stranger than her own were bent on the ground with a mixture of bashful embarrassment and fear. Yet there was a necessity to speak, or at least she thought so, and in a fluttered accent she began to mention her wonderful escape, in which she was sure that the stranger must, under heaven, have been her father's protector and her own. He seemed to shrink from her expressions of gratitude, while he replied abruptly, "I leave you, madam." The deep melody of his voice rendered powerful, but not harsh, by something like a severity of tone. "I leave you to the protection of those to whom it is possible you may have this day been a guardian angel." Lucy was surprised at the ambiguity of his language, and with a feeling of artless and unaffected gratitude, began to deprecate the idea of having intended to give her deliverer any offence, as if such a thing had been possible. "I have been unfortunate," she said, "in endeavouring to express my thanks. I am sure it must be so, though I cannot recollect what I said. But would you but stay till my father, till the Lord Keeper, comes, would you only permit him to pay you his thanks, and to inquire your name?" "My name is unnecessary," answered the stranger. "Your father, I would rather say Sir William Ashton, will learn it soon enough, for all the pleasure it is likely to afford him." "You mistake him," said Lucy earnestly. "He will be grateful for my sake and for his own. You do not know my father, or you are deceiving me with a story of his safety, when he has already fallen a victim to the fury of that animal." When she had caught this idea, she started from the ground and endeavoured to press towards the avenue in which the accident had taken place, while the stranger, though he seemed to hesitate between the desire to assist and the wish to leave her, was obliged, in common humanity, to oppose her both by entreaty and action. "On the word of a gentleman, madam, I tell you the truth. Your father is in perfect safety. You will expose yourself to injury if you venture back where the herd of wild cattle grazed. If you will go—" For having once adopted the idea that her father was still in danger, she pressed forward in spite of him. "If you will go, accept my arm, though I am not perhaps the person who can with most propriety offer you support." But without heeding his intimation, Lucy took him at his word. "Oh, if you be a man," she said, "if you be a gentleman, assist me to find my father. You shall not leave me. You must go with me. He is dying, perhaps, while we are talking here." Then, without listening to excuse or apology, and holding fast by the stranger's arm, though unconscious of anything save the support which it gave, and without which she could not have moved, mixed with a vague feeling of preventing his escape from her. She was urging and almost dragging him forward when Sir William Ashton came up, followed by the female attendant of blind Alice, and by 2 woodcutters, whom he had suffered from their occupation to his assistance. His joy at seeing his daughter safe overcame the surprise with which he would, at another time, have beheld her hanging as familiarly on the arm of a stranger as she might have done upon his own. "Lucy, my dear Lucy, are you safe? Are you well?" were the only words that broke from him as he embraced her in ecstasy. "I am well, sir, thank God, and still more that I see you so. But this gentleman," she said, quitting his arm and shrinking from him, "what must he think of me?" And her eloquent blood, flushing over neck and brow, spoke how much she was ashamed of the freedom with which she had craved, and even compelled, his assistance. "This gentleman," said Sir William Ashton, "will, I trust, not regret the trouble we have given him, when I assure him of the gratitude of the Lord Keeper for the greatest service which one man ever rendered to another. For the life of my child, for my own life, which he has saved by his bravery and presence of mind, he will, I am sure, permit us to request—" "Request nothing of me, my lord," said the stranger, in a stern and peremptory tone. "I am the Master of Ravenswood." There was a dead pause of surprise, not unmixed with less pleasant feelings. The Master wrapped himself in his cloak, made a haughty inclination toward Lucy, muttering a few words of courtesy, as indistinctly heard as they seemed to be reluctantly uttered, and turning from them, was immediately lost in the thicket. "The Master of Ravenswood!" said the Lord Keeper, when he had recovered his momentary astonishment. "Hasten after him, stop him, beg him to speak to me for a single moment." The 2 foresters accordingly set off in pursuit of the stranger. They speedily reappeared, and, in an embarrassed and awkward manner, said the gentleman would not return. The Lord Keeper took one of the fellows aside, and questioned him more closely what the Master of Ravenswood had said. "He just said he wouldna come back," said the man, with the caution of a prudent Scotchman, who cared not to be the bearer of an unpleasant errand. "He said something more, sir," said the Lord Keeper, "and I insist on knowing what it was." "Why then, my lord," said the man, looking down, "he said—but it would be nae pleasure to your lordship to hear it, for I dare say the master meant nae ill." "That's none of your concern, sir. I desire to hear the very words." "Weel then," replied the man, "he said, tell Sir William Ashton that the next time he and I foregather, he will not be half sae blithe of our meeting as of our parting." "Very well, sir," said the Lord Keeper. "I believe he alludes to a wager we have on our hawks. It is a matter of no consequence." He turned to his daughter, who was by this time so much recovered as to be able to walk home. But the effect which the various recollections connected with a scene so terrific made upon a mind which was susceptible in an extreme degree was more permanent than the injury which her nerves had sustained. Visions of terror, both in sleep and in waking reveries, recalled to her the form of the furious animal, and the dreadful bellow with which he accompanied his career, and it was always the image of the Master of Ravenswood, with his native nobleness of countenance and form, that seemed to interpose betwixt her and assured death. It is perhaps at all times dangerous for a young person to suffer recollection, to dwell repeatedly, and with too much complacency, on the same individual. But in Lucy's situation it was almost unavoidable. She had never happened to see a young man of mien and features so romantic and so striking as young Ravenswood. But had she seen 100 his equals, or his superiors in those particulars, no one else would have been linked to her heart by the strong associations of remembered danger and escape, of gratitude, wonder, and curiosity. I say curiosity, for it is likely that the singularly restrained and unaccommodating manners of the Master of Ravenswood, so much at variance with the natural expression of his features and grace of his deportment, as the excited wonder by the contrast, had their effect in riveting her attention to the recollections. She knew little of Ravenswood, or the disputes which had existed betwixt her father and his, and perhaps could, in her gentleness of mind, hardly have comprehended the angry and bitter passions which they had engendered. But she knew that he was come of noble stem, was poor though descended from the noble and the wealthy, and she felt that she could sympathise with the feelings of a proud mind, which urged him to recoil from the proffered gratitude of the new proprietors of his father's house and domains. Would he have equally shunned their acknowledgments and avoided their intimacy, had her father's request been urged more mildly, less abruptly, and softened with the grace which women so well know how to throw into their manner, when they mean to mediate betwixt the headlong passions of the ruder sex? This was a perilous question to ask her own mind, perilous both in the idea and in its consequences. Lucy Ashton, in short, was involved in those mazes of the imagination which are most dangerous to the young and the sensitive. Time, it is true, absence, change of scene, and new faces, might probably have destroyed the illusion in her instance, as it has done in many others, but her residence remained solitary, and her mind without those means of dissipating her pleasing visions. This solitude was chiefly owing to the absence of Lady Ashton, who was at this time in Edinburgh, watching the progress of some state intrigue. The Lord Keeper only received society out of policy or ostentation, and was by nature rather reserved and unsociable, and thus no cavalier appeared to rival or to obscure the ideal picture of chivalrous excellence which Lucy had pictured to herself in the Master of Ravenswood. While Lucy indulged in these dreams, she made frequent visits to old blind Alice, hoping it would be easy to lead her to talk on the subject which at present she had so imprudently admitted to occupy so large a portion of her thoughts. But Alice did not in this particular gratify her wishes and expectations. She spoke readily and with pathetic feeling concerning the family in general, but seemed to observe an especial and cautious silence on the subject of the present representative. The little she said of him was not altogether so favourable as Lucy had anticipated. She hinted that he was of a stern and unforgiving character, more ready to resent than to pardon injuries, and Lucy combined with great alarm the hints which she now dropped of these dangerous qualities with Alice's advice to her father, so emphatically given, to beware of Ravenswood. But that very Ravenswood, of whom such unjust suspicions had been entertained, had almost immediately after they had been uttered confuted them by saving at once her father's life and her own. Had he nourished such black revenge as Alice's dark hints seemed to indicate, no deed of active guilt was necessary to the full gratification of that evil passion. He needed but to have withheld for an instant his indispensable and effective assistance, and the object of his resentment must have perished, without any direct aggression on his part, by a death equally fearful and certain. She conceived, therefore, that some secret prejudice, or the suspicions incident to age and misfortune, had led Alice to form conclusions injurious to the character, and irreconcilable both with the generous conduct and noble features of the Master of Ravenswood. And in this belief Lucy reposed her hope, and went on weaving her enchanted web of fairy tissue, as beautiful and transient as the film of the gossamer when it is pearled with the mountain dew and glimmering to the sun. Her father, in the meanwhile, as well as the Master of Ravenswood, were making reflections, as frequent though more solid than those of Lucy, upon the singular event which had taken place. The Lord Keeper's first task, when he returned home, was to ascertain by medical advice that his daughter had sustained no injury from the dangerous and alarming situation in which she had been placed. Satisfied on this topic, he proceeded to revise the memoranda which he had taken down from the mouth of the person employed to interrupt the funeral service of the late Lord Ravenswood. Bred to casuistry, and well accustomed to practise the ambidexter ingenuity of the bar, it cost him little trouble to soften the features of the tumult which he had been at first so anxious to exaggerate. He preached to his colleagues of the Privy Council the necessity of using conciliatory measures with young men whose blood and temper were hot, and their experience of life limited. he did not hesitate to attribute some censure to the conduct of the officer, as having been unnecessarily irritating. These were the contents of his public dispatches. The letters which he wrote to those private friends into whose management the matter was likely to fall were of a yet more favourable tenor. He represented that lenity in this case would be equally politic and popular, whereas, considering the high respect with which the rites of interment are regarded in Scotland, any severity exercised against the Master of Ravenswood for protecting those of his father from interruption would be on all sides most unfavourably construed. And finally, assuming the language of a generous and high-spirited man, he made it his particular request that this affair should be passed over without severe notice. He alluded with delicacy to the predicament in which he himself stood with young Ravenswood, as having succeeded in the long train of litigation by which the fortunes of that noble house had been so much reduced, and confessed it would be most peculiarly acceptable to his own feelings could he find in some sort to counterbalance the disadvantages which he had occasioned the family, though only in the prosecution of his just and lawful rights. He therefore made it his particular and personal request that the matter should have no farther consequences, and insinuated a desire that he himself should have the merit of having put a stop to it by his favourable report and intercession. It was particularly remarkable that, contrary to his uniform practice, he made no special communication to Lady Ashton upon the subject of the tumult, and although he mentioned the alarm which Lucy had received from one of the wild cattle, yet he gave no detailed account of an incident so interesting and terrible. There was much surprise among Sir William Ashton's political friends and colleagues on receiving letters of a tenor so unexpected. On comparing notes together, one smiled, one put up his eyebrows, a third nodded acquiescence in the general wonder, and a fourth asked if they were sure these were all the letters the Lord Keeper had written on the subject. "It runs strangely in my mind, my lords, that none of these advices contain the root of the matter." But no secret letters of a contrary nature had been received, although the question seemed to imply the possibility of their existence. "Well," said an old grey-headed statesman, who had contrived, by shifting and trimming, to maintain his post at the steerage through all the changes of course which the vessel had held for 30 years, "I thought Sir William would have verified the old Scottish saying, as soon comes a lamb's skin to market as the old tups." "We must please him after his own fashion," said another, "though it be an unlooked-for one." "A wilful man maun hae his way," answered the old counsellor. "The Keeper will rue this before year and day are out," said a third. "The Master of Ravenswood is the lad to wind him a pirn." "Why, what would you do, my lords, with the poor young fellow?" said a noble marquis present. "The Lord Keeper has got all his estates, he has not a cross to bless himself with." On which the ancient Lord Turntippet replied, if he hasna gear to fine, he ha shins to pine. And that was our way before the Revolution. Lucitur cum persona, qui luere non potest cum crumena. Heh, my lords, that's good law Latin. "I can see no motive," replied the Marquis, "that any noble lord can have for urging this matter farther. Let the Lord Keeper have the power to deal in it as he pleases." "Agree, agree. Remit to the Lord Keeper, with any other person for fashion's sake. Lord Hirplehooly, who is bedridden, one to be a quorum. Make your entry in the minutes, Mr. Clerk. And now, my lords, there is that young Scattergood, the Laird of Bucklaw's fine, to be disposed upon. I suppose it goes to my Lord Treasurer?" "Shame be in my meal poke, then," exclaimed the Lord Turntippet, "and your hand aye in the nook of it. I had set that down for a bye-bit between meals for mysell." "To use one of your favourite saws, my lord," replied the Marquis, "you are like the miller's dog, that licks his lips before the bag is untied. The man is not fined yet." "But that costs but twa scarps of a pen," said Lord Turntippet; "and surely there is nae noble lord that will presume to say that I, wha hae complied wi' all compliances, ta'en all manner of tests, adjured all that was to be abjured, and sworn all that was to be sworn,
for these 30 years bypast, sticking fast by my duty to the state through good report and bad report, shouldna hae something now and then to sign my mouth wi', after sic drouthy work, eh?" "It would be very unreasonable indeed, my lord," replied the Marquis, "had we either thought that your lordship's drought was quenchable, or observed anything stick in your throat that required washing down." And so we close the scene on the Privy Council of that period. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Henry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 6. For this are all these warriors come, to hear an idle tale, and o'er our death-accustomed arms shall silly tears prevail? Henry Mackenzie. On the evening of the day when the Lord Keeper and his daughter were saved from such imminent peril, two strangers were seated in the most private apartment of a small obscure inn, or rather alehouse, called the Tod's Den, about 3 or 4 miles from the castle of Ravenswood, and about as far from the ruinous tower of Wolf's Crag, betwixt which two places it was situated. One of these strangers was about 40 years of age, tall, and thin in the flanks, with an aquiline nose, dark penetrating eyes, and a shrewd but sinister cast of countenance. The other was about 15 years younger, short, stout, ruddy-faced, and red-haired, with an open, resolute, and cheerful eye, to which careless and fearless freedom and inward daring gave fire and expression, notwithstanding its light grey colour. A stoup of wine, for in those days it was served out from the cask in pewter flagons, was placed on the table, and each had his quaich or bicker before him. But there was little appearance of conviviality. With folded arms and looks of anxious expectation, they eyed each other in silence, each wrapped in his own thoughts, and holding no communication with his neighbour. At length the younger broke silence by exclaiming, "What the foul fiend can detain the master so long? He must have miscarried in his enterprise. Why did you dissuade me from going with him?" "One man is enough to right his own wrong," said the taller and older personage. "We venture our lives for him in coming thus far on such an errand." "You are but a craven after all, Craigengelt," answered the younger, "and that's what many folk have thought you before now." "But what none has dared to tell me," said Craigengelt, laying his hand on the hilt of his sword, "and, but that I hold a hasty man no better than a fool, I would—" He paused for his companion's answer. "Would you?" said the other coolly; "and why do you not then?" Craigengelt drew his cutlass an inch or two, and then returned it with violence into the scabbard. "Because there is a deeper stake to be played for than the lives of 20 hare-brained gulks like you." "You're right there," said his companion, "for if it were not that these forfeitures, and that last fine for the old driveller Turntippet is gaping for, and which I dare say is laid on by this time, have fairly driven me out of house and home, I were a coxcomb and a cuckoo to boot, to trust your fair promises of getting me a commission in the Irish Brigade. What have I to do with the Irish Brigade? I am a plain Scotchman, as my father was before me, and my grand-aunt, Lady Girnington, cannot live for ever." "Ay, Bucklaw," observed Craigengelt, "but she may live for many a long day. And for your father, he had land and living, kept himself close from wadsetters and money-lenders, paid each man his due, and lived on his own." "And whose fault is it that I have not done so too?" said Bucklaw. "Whose but the devil's and yours, and such like as you, that have led me to the far end of a fair estate? And now I shall be obliged, I suppose, to shelter and shift about like yourself, live 1 week upon a line of secret intelligence from Saint Germain, another upon a report of a rising in the Highlands, get my breakfast and morning draught of sack from old Jacobite ladies, and give them locks of my old wig for the chevalier's hair, second my friend in his quarrel till he comes to the field, and then flinch from him, lest so important a political agent should perish from the way. All this I must do for bread, besides calling myself a captain." "You think you're making a fine speech now," said Craigengelt, "and showing much wit at my expense. Is starving or hanging better than the life I am obliged to lead, because the present fortunes of the king cannot sufficiently support his envoys? Starving is honester, Craigengelt, and hanging is like to be the end on't. But what you mean to make of this poor fellow Ravenswood, I know not. He has no money left, any more than I. His lands are all pawned and pledged, and the interest eats up the rents, and is not satisfied. And what do you hope to make by meddling in his affairs?" "Content yourself, Bucklaw. I know my business," replied Craigengelt. "Besides that his name and his father's services in 1689 will make such an acquisition sound well both at Versailles and Saint Germain. You will also please be informed that the Master of Ravenswood is a very different kind of a young fellow from you. He has parts and address, as well as courage and talents, and will present himself abroad like a young man of head as well as heart, who knows something more than the speed of a horse or the flight of a hawk. I have lost credit of late by bringing over no one that had sense to know more than how to unharbour a stag, or take and reclaim an eyas. The master has education, sense, and penetration." "And yet is not wise enough to escape the tricks of a kidnapper, Craigengelt," replied the younger man. "But don't be angry, you know you will not fight, and so it is as well to leave your hilt in peace and quiet, and tell me in sober guise how you drew the master into your confidence." "By flattering his love of vengeance, Bucklaw," answered Craigengelt. "He has always distrusted me, but I watched my time, and struck while his temper was red hot with the sense of insult and of wrong. He goes now to expostulate, as he says and perhaps thinks, with Sir William Ashton. I say that if they meet, and the lawyer puts him to his defence, the master will kill him, for he had that sparkle in his eye which never deceives you when you would read a man's purpose. At any rate, he will give him such a bullying as will be construed into an assault on a privy councillor. So there will be a total breach betwixt him and government. Scotland will be too hot for him, France will gain him, and we will all set sail together in the French brig L'Espoir, which is hovering for us off Eyemouth." "Content am I," said Bucklaw. "Scotland has little left that I care about, and if carrying the master with us will get us a better reception in France, why, so be it, in God's name. I doubt our own merits will procure us slender preferment, and I trust he will send a ball through the keeper's head before he joins us. One or two of these scoundrel statesmen should be shot once a year, just to keep the others on their good behaviour." "That is very true," replied Craigengelt, "and it reminds me that I must go and see that our horses have been fed and are in readiness, for should such deed be done, it will be no time for grass to grow beneath their heels." He proceeded as far as the door, then turned back with a look of earnestness, and said to Bucklaw, "Whatever should come of this business, I am sure you will do me the justice to remember that I said nothing to the master which could imply my accession to any act of violence which he may take it into his head to commit." "No, no, not a single word like accession," replied Bucklaw. "You know too well the risk belonging to these two terrible words, art and part." Then, as if to himself, he recited the following lines: "The dial spoke not, but it made shrewd signs, and pointed full upon the stroke of murder." "What is that you're talking to yourself?" said Craigengelt, turning back with some anxiety. "Nothing, only two lines I have heard upon the stage," replied his companion. "Bucklaw," said Craigengelt, "I sometimes think you should have been a stage player yourself. All is fancy and frolic with you." "I have often thought so myself," said Bucklaw. "I believe it would be safer than acting with you in the fatal conspiracy. But away, play your own part, and look after the horses like a groom as you are. A play actor, a stage player," he repeated to himself. that would have deserved a stab, and that Craigengelt's a coward, and yet I should like the profession well enough. Stay, let me see. Aye, I would come out in Alexander. Thus from the grave I rise to save my love. Draw all your swords and quick as lightning move. When I rush on, sure none will dare to stay. 'Tis love commands and glory leads the way. As with a voice of thunder, and his hand upon his sword, Bucklaw repeated the ranting couplets of poor Lee. Craigengelt re-entered with a face of alarm. "We are undone, Bucklaw. The master's led horse has cast himself over his halter in the stable, and is dead lame. His hackney will be set up with the day's work, and now he has no fresh horse. He will never get off." "Egad, there will be no moving with the speed of lightning this bout," said Bucklaw dryly. "But stay, you can give him yours." "What, and be taken myself? I thank you for the proposal," said Craigengelt. "Why," replied Bucklaw, "if the Lord Keeper should have met with a mischance, which for my part I cannot suppose, for the master is not the lad to shoot an old and unarmed man, but if there should have been a fray at the castle, you're neither art nor part in it, you know, so have nothing to fear." "True, true," answered the other, with embarrassment; "but consider my commission from Saint Germain." "Which many men think is a commission of your own making, noble captain. Well, if you will not give him your horse, why, it, he must have mine." "Yours?" said Craigengelt. "Ay, mine," repeated Bucklaw. "It shall never be said that I agreed to back a gentleman in a little affair of honour, and neither helped him on with it nor off from it." "You will give him your horse? And have you considered the loss?" "Loss? Why, Grey Gilbert cost me 20 Jacobuses, that's true, but then his hackney is worth something, and his black moor is worth twice as much were he sound, and I know how to handle him. Take a fat sucking mastiff whelp, flay and bowel him, stuff the body full of black and grey snails, roast a reasonable time, and baste with oil of spikenard, saffron, cinnamon, and honey, anoint with the dripping, working it in—" "Yes, Bucklaw, but in the meanwhile, before the sprain is cured, nay, before the whelp is roasted, you will be caught and hung. Depend on it, the chase will be hard after Ravenswood. I wish we had made our place of rendezvous nearer to the coast." "On my faith, then," said Bucklaw, "I had best go off just now, and leave my horse for him. Stay, stay, he comes. I hear a horse's feet." "Are you sure there is only one?" said Craigengelt. "I fear there is a chase. I think I hear 3 or 4 galloping together. I am sure I hear more horses than one." "Pooh, pooh, it is the wench of the house clattering to the well in her pattens. By my faith, captain, you should give up both your captainship and your secret service, for you are as easily scared as a wild goose. But here comes the master alone, and looking as gloomy as a night in November." The Master of Ravenswood entered the room accordingly, his cloak muffled around him, his arms folded, his looks stern, and at the same time dejected. He flung his cloak from him as he entered, threw himself upon a chair, and appeared sunk in a profound reverie. "What has happened? What have you done?" was hastily demanded by Craigengelt and Bucklaw in the same moment. "Nothing," was the short and sullen answer. "Nothing? And left us determined to call the old villain to account for all the injuries that you, we, and the country have received at his hand. Have you seen him?" "I have," replied the Master of Ravenswood. "Seen him, and come away without settling scores which have been so long due?" said Bucklaw. "I would not have expected that at the hand of the Master of Ravenswood." "No matter what you expected," replied Ravenswood, "it is not to you, sir, that I shall be disposed to render any reason for my conduct." "Patience, Bucklaw," said Craigengelt, interrupting his companion, who seemed about to make an angry reply. "The master has been interrupted in his purpose by some accident, but he must excuse the anxious curiosity of friends who are devoted to his cause, like you and me." "Friends, Captain Craigengelt!" retorted Ravenswood haughtily. "I am ignorant what familiarity passed betwixt us to entitle you to use that expression. I think our friendship amounts to this, that we agreed to leave Scotland together so soon as I should have visited the alienated mansion of my fathers, and had an interview with its present possessor. I will not call him proprietor." "Very true, master," answered Bucklaw; "and as we thought you had in mind to do something to put your neck in jeopardy, Craigie and I very courteously agreed to tarry for you, although ours might run some risk in consequence. As to Craigie, indeed, it does not very much signify. He had gallows written on his brow in the hour of his birth, but I should not like to discredit my parentage by coming to such an end in another man's cause." "Gentlemen," said the Master of Ravenswood, "I am sorry if I have occasioned you any inconvenience, but I must claim the right of judging what is best for my own affairs, without rendering explanations to any one. I have altered my mind, and do not design to leave the country this season." "Not to leave the country, master!" exclaimed Craigengelt. "Not to go over, after all the trouble and expense I have incurred, after all the risk of discovery, and the expense of freight and demurrage?" "Sir," replied the Master of Ravenswood, "when I designed to leave this country in this haste, I made use of your obliging offer to procure me means of conveyance, but I do not recollect that I pledged myself to go off if I found occasion to alter my mind. For your trouble on my account I am sorry, and I thank you. Your expense," he added, putting his hand into his pocket, "admits a more solid compensation. Freight and demurrage are matters with which I am unacquainted, Captain Craigengelt, but take my purse and pay yourself according to your own conscience." And accordingly he tendered a purse with some gold in it to the soi-disant captain. But here Bucklaw interposed in his turn. "Your fingers, Craigie, seem to itch for that same piece of green network," said he; "but I make my vow to God, that if they offer to close upon it, I will chop them off with my whinger. Since the master has changed his mind, I suppose we need stay here no longer; but in the first place, I beg leave to tell him—" "Tell him anything you will," said Craigengelt, "if you will first allow me to state the inconveniences to which he will expose himself by quitting our society, to remind him of the obstacles of his remaining here, and of the difficulties attending his proper introduction at Versailles and Saint Germain, without the countenance of those who have established useful connections." "Besides forfeiting the friendship," said Bucklaw, "of at least one man of spirit and honour." "Gentlemen," said Ravenswood, "permit me once more to assure you that you have been pleased to attach to our temporary connexion more importance than I ever meant that it should have. When I repair to foreign courts, I shall not need the introduction of an intriguing adventurer, nor is it necessary for me to set value on the friendship of a hot-headed bully." With these words, and without waiting for an answer, he left the apartment, remounted his horse, and was heard to ride off. "Morbleu!" said Captain Craigengelt, "my recruit is lost." "Ay, captain," said Bucklaw, "the salmon is off with hook and all; but I will after him, for I have had more of his insolence than I can well digest." Craigengelt offered to accompany him, but Bucklaw replied, "No, no, captain, keep you the check of the chimney nook till I come back. It's good sleeping in a hale skin. Little kens the auld wife that sits by the fire how cauld the wind blaws in Hurlyburly Swire." And singing as he went, he left the apartment. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 7. Now, Billy Berwick, keep good heart, and off thee talking let me be. But if thou art a man, as I am sure thou art, come over the dyke and fight with me. Old Ballad. The Master of Ravenswood had mounted the ambling hackney which he before rode, on finding the accident which had happened to his led horse, and for the animal's ease was proceeding at a slow pace from the Tod's Den towards his old tower of Wolf's Crag, when he heard the galloping of a horse behind him, and looking back, perceived that he was pursued by young Bucklaw, who had been delayed a few minutes in the pursuit by the irresistible temptation of giving the hostler at the Tod's Den some recipe for treating the lame horse. This brief delay he had made up by hard galloping, and now overtook the Master where the road traversed a waste moor. "Halt, sir!" cried Bucklaw. "I am no political agent, no Captain Craigengelt, whose life is too important to be hazarded in defence of his honour. I am Frank Hayston of Bucklaw, and no man injures me by word, deed, sign, or look, but he must render me an account of it." "This is all very well, Mr. Hayston of Bucklaw," replied the Master of Ravenswood, in a tone the most calm and indifferent; "but I have no quarrel with you, and desire to have none. Our roads homeward, as well as our roads through life, lie in different directions. There is no occasion for us crossing each other." "Is there not?" said Bucklaw impetuously. "By heaven! But I say that there is, though. You called us intriguing adventurers." "Be correct in your recollection, Mr. Hayston. It was to your companion only I applied that epithet, and you know him to be no better." "And what then? He was my companion for the time, and no man shall insult my companion, right or wrong, while he is in my company." "Then, Mr. Hayston," replied Ravenswood with the same composure, "you should choose your society better, or you are like to have much work in your capacity of their champion. Go home, sir, sleep, and have more reason in your wrath to-morrow." "Not so, master; you have mistaken your man. High airs and wise saws shall not carry it off thus. Besides, you termed me bully, and you shall retract the word before we part." "Faith, scarcely," said Ravenswood, "unless you show me better reason for thinking myself mistaken than you are now producing." "Then, master," said Bucklaw, "though I should be sorry to offer it to a man of your quality, if you will not justify your incivility, or retract it, or name a place of meeting, you must here undergo the hard word and the hard blow." "Neither will be necessary," said Ravenswood. "I am satisfied with what I have done to avoid an affair with you. If you are serious, this place will serve as well as another." "Dismount, then, and draw," said Bucklaw, setting him an example. "I always thought and said you were a pretty man. I should be sorry to report you otherwise." "You shall have no reason, sir," said Ravenswood, alighting and putting himself in a posture of defence. Their swords crossed, and the combat commenced with great spirit on the part of Bucklaw, who was well accustomed to affairs of the kind, and distinguished by address and dexterity at his weapon. In the present case, however, he did not use his skill to advantage, for having lost temper at the cool and contemptuous manner in which the Master of Ravenswood had long refused and at length granted him satisfaction, and urged by his impatience, he adopted the part of an assailant with inconsiderate eagerness. The Master, with equal skill and much greater composure, remained chiefly on the defensive, and even declined to avail himself of one or two advantages afforded him by the eagerness of his adversary. At length, in a desperate lunge, which he followed with an attempt to close, Bucklaw's foot slipped, and he fell on the short grassy turf on which they were fighting. "Take your life, sir," said the Master of Ravenswood, "and mend it if you can." "It would be but a cobbled piece of work, I fear," said Bucklaw, rising slowly and gathering up his sword, much less disconcerted with the issue of the combat than could have been expected from the impetuosity of his temper. "I thank you for my life, master," he pursued. "There is my hand. I bear no ill will to you, either for my bad luck or for your better swordsmanship." The Master looked steadily at him for an instant, then extended his hand to him. "Bucklaw," he said, "you are a generous fellow, and I have done you wrong. I heartily ask your pardon for the expression which offended you. It was hastily and incautiously uttered. and I am convinced it is totally misapplied." "Are you indeed, master?" said Bucklaw, his face resuming at once its natural expression of light-hearted carelessness and audacity. "That is more than I expected of you; for, master, men say you are not ready to retract your opinion and your language." "Not when I have well considered them," said the master. "Then you are a little wiser than I am, for I always give my friend satisfaction first and explanation afterwards. If one of us falls, all accounts are settled. If not, men are never so ready for peace as after war. But what does that bawling brat of a boy want?" said Bucklaw. "I wish to heaven he had come a few minutes sooner, and yet it must have been ended some time, and perhaps this way is as well as any other." As he spoke, the boy he mentioned came up, cudgelling an ass on which he was mounted, to the top of its speed, and sending, like one of Ossian's heroes, his voice before him. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, save yourselves! For the goodwife bade us tell you there were folk in her house had ta'en Captain Craigengelt, and were seeking for Bucklaw, and that ye behoved to ride for it." "By my faith, and that's very true, my man," said Bucklaw, "and there's a silver sixpence for your news, and I would give any man twice as much would tell me which way I should ride." "That will I, Bucklaw," said Ravenswood. "Ride home to Wolf's Crag with me. There are places in the old tower where you might lie hid, were 1,000 men to seek you. But that will bring you into trouble yourself, master; and unless you be in the Jacobite scrape already, it is quite needless for me to drag you in." "Not a whit. I have nothing to fear." "Then I will ride with you blithely, for, to say the truth, I do not know the rendezvous that Craigie was to guide us to this night, and I am sure that, if he is taken, he will tell all the truth of me, and 20 lies of you, in order to save himself from the withy." They mounted and rode off in company accordingly, striking off the ordinary road, and holding their way by wild, moorish, unfrequented paths, with which the gentlemen were well acquainted from the exercise of the chase, but through which others would have had much difficulty in tracing their course. They rode for some time in silence, making such haste as the condition of Ravenswood horse permitted, until night having gradually closed around them, they discontinued their speed, both from the difficulty of discovering their path, and from the hope that they were beyond the reach of pursuit or observation. "And now that we have drawn bridle a bit," said Bucklaw, "I would fain ask you a question, master." "Ask and welcome," said Ravenswood, "but forgive not answering it, unless I think proper." "Well, it is simply this," answered his late antagonist. "What, in the name of old Sathan, could make you, who stand so highly on your reputation, think for a moment of drawing up with such a rogue as Craigengelt, and such a scapegrace as folk call Bucklaw?" "Simply because I was desperate, and sought desperate associates." "And what made you break off from us at the nearest?" again demanded Bucklaw. "Because I had changed my mind," said the master, "and renounced my enterprise, at least for the present. And now that I have answered your questions fairly and frankly, tell me what makes you associate with Craigengelt, so much beneath you both in birth and in spirit." "In plain terms," answered Bucklaw, "because I am a fool, who have gambled away my land in these times. My grand aunt, Lady Girnington, has ta'en a new tack of life, I think, and I could only hope to get something by a change of government. Craigie was a sort of gambling acquaintance. He saw my condition, and, as the devil is always at one's elbow, told me 50 lies about his credentials from Versailles, and his interest at Saint Germain, promised me a captain's commission at Paris, and I have been ass enough to put my thumb under his belt. I dare say by this time he has told a dozen pretty stories of me to the government, and this is what I have got by wine, women, and dice, cocks, dogs, and horses." "Yes, Bucklaw," said the master, "you have indeed nourished in your bosom the snakes that are now stinging you." "That's home as well as true, master," replied his companion; "but by your leave, you have nursed in your bosom one great goodly snake that has swallowed all the rest, and is as sure to devour you as my half dozen are to make a meal on all that's left of Bucklaw, which is but what lies between bonnet and boot heel." "I must not," answered the Master of Ravenswood, "challenge the freedom of speech in which I have set example. What, to speak without a metaphor, do you call this monstrous passion which you charge me with fostering?" "Revenge, my good sir, revenge, which, if it be as gentle manlike a sin as wine and wassail, with their et ceteras, is equally unchristian, and not so bloodless. It is better breaking a park pale to watch a doe or damsel than to shoot an old man." "I deny the purpose," said the Master of Ravenswood. "On my soul, I had no such intention. I meant but to confront the oppressor ere I left my native land, and upbraid him with his tyranny and its consequences. I would have stated my wrongs so that they would have shaken his soul within him." "Yes," answered Bucklaw, "and he would have collared you and cried 'Help!' and then you would have shaken the soul out of him, I suppose. Your very look and manner would have frightened the old man to death." "Consider the provocation," answered Ravenswood; "consider the ruin and death procured and caused by his hard-hearted cruelty. An ancient house destroyed, an affectionate father murdered. Why, in our old Scottish days, he that sat quiet under such wrongs would have been held neither fit to back a friend nor face a foe. Well, master, I am glad to see that the devil deals as cunningly with other folk as he deals with me; for whenever I am about to commit any folly, he persuades me it is the most necessary, gallant, gentlemanlike thing on earth, and I am up to saddle girths in the bog before I see that the ground is soft. And you, master, might have turned out a murd, a homicide, just out of pure respect for your father's memory." "There is more sense in your language, Bucklaw," replied the Master, "than might have been expected from your conduct. It is too true, our vices steal upon us, in forms outwardly as fair as those of the demons whom the superstitious represent as intriguing with the human race, and are not discovered in their native hideousness until we have clasped them in our arms." "But we may throw them from us, though," said Bucklaw, "and that is what I shall think of doing one of these days; that is, when old Lady Girnington dies." "Did you ever hear the expression of the English divine?" said Ravenswood. "Hell is paved with good intentions," as much as to say, they are more often formed than executed. "Well," replied Bucklaw, "but I will begin this blessed night, and have determined not to drink above 1 quart of wine, unless your claret be of extraordinary quality." "You will find little to tempt you at Wolf's Crag," said the Master. "I know not that I can promise you more than the shelter of my roof. All, and more than all, our stock of wine and provisions was exhausted at the late occasion. Long may it be ere provision is needed for the like purpose," answered Bucklaw. "But you should not drink up the last flask at a dirge. There is ill luck in that." "There is ill luck, I think, in whatever belongs to me," said Ravenswood. "But yonder is Wolf's Crag, and whatever it still contains is at your service." The roar of the sea had long announced their approach to the cliffs, on the summit of which, like the nest of some sea-eagle, the founder of the fortalice had perched his eyrie. The pale moon, which had hitherto been contending with flitting clouds, now shone out, and gave them a view of the solitary and naked tower, situated on a projecting cliff that beetled on the German Ocean. On 3 sides the rock was precipitous; on the 4th, which was that towards the land, it had been originally fenced by an artificial ditch and drawbridge, but the latter was broken down and ruinous, and the former had been in part filled up, so as to allow passage for a horseman into the narrow courtyard, encircled on 2 sides with low offices and stables, partly ruinous, and closed on the landward front by a low embattled wall, while the remaining side of the quadrangle was occupied by the tower itself, which, tall and narrow, and built of a greyish stone, stood glimmering in the moonlight like the sheeted spectre of some huge giant. A wilder and more disconsolate dwelling it was perhaps difficult to conceive. The sombrous and heavy sound of the billows, successfully dashing against the rocky beach at a profound distance beneath, was to the ear what the landscape was to the eye, a symbol of unvaried and monotonous melancholy, not unmingled with horror. Although the night was not far advanced, there was no sign of living inhabitant about this forlorn abode. excepting that one and only one of the narrow and stanchioled windows, which appeared at irregular heights and distances in the walls of the building, showed a small glimmer of light. "There," said Ravenswood, "sits the only male domestic that remains to the house of Ravenswood, and it is well that he does remain there, since otherwise we had little hope to find either light or fire. But follow me cautiously. The road is narrow, and admits only one horse in front." In effect, the path led along a kind of isthmus, at the peninsular extremity of which the tower was situated, with that exclusive attention to strength and security, in preference to every circumstance of convenience, which dictated to the Scottish barons the choice of their situations, as well as their style of building. By adopting the cautious mode of approach recommended by the proprietor of this wild hold, they entered the courtyard in safety, but it was long ere the efforts of Ravenswood, though loudly exerted by knocking at the low-browed entrance, and repeated shouts to Caleb to open the gate and admit them, received any answer. "The old man must be departed," he began to say, "or fallen into some fit, for the noise I have made would have waked the 7 sleepers." At length a timid and hesitating voice replied, "Master? Master of Ravenswood, is it you?" "Yes, it is, Caleb. Open the door quickly." "But it is you in very blood and body? For I would sooner face 50 devils as my master's ghaist, or even his wraith. Wherefore, aroint ye, if you were 10 times my master, unless ye come in bodily shape, lith and limb." "It is I, you old fool," answered Ravenswood, "in bodily shape, and alive, save that I am half dead with cold." The light at the upper window disappeared, and glancing from loophole to loophole in slow succession, gave intimation that the bearer was in the act of descending, with great deliberation, a winding staircase occupying one of the turrets which graced the angles of the old tower. The tardiness of his descent extracted some exclamations of impatience from Ravenswood, and several oaths from his less patient and more mercurial companion. Caleb again paused ere he unbolted the door, and once more asked if they were men of mould that demanded entrance at this time of night. "Were I near you, you old fool," said Bucklaw, "I would give you sufficient proofs of my bodily condition." "Open the gate, Caleb," said his master in a more soothing tone, partly from his regard to the ancient and faithful seneschal, partly perhaps because he thought that angry words would be thrown away, so long as Caleb had a stout iron-clenched oaken door betwixt his person and the speaker's. At length Caleb, with a trembling hand, undid the bars, opened the heavy door, and stood before them, exhibiting his thin grey hairs, bald forehead, and sharp high features, illuminated by a quivering lamp which he held in one hand, while he shaded and protected its flame with the other. The timorous, courteous glance which he threw around him, the effect of the partial light upon his white hair and illumined features, might have made a good painting, but our travellers were too impatient for security against the rising storm to permit them to indulge themselves in studying the picturesque. "Is it you, my dear master? Is it you yourself, indeed?" exclaimed the old domestic. "I am wae ye should have stood waiting at your ain gate, but wha wad hae thought of seeing ye sae soon, and a strange gentleman with a—" Here he exclaimed apart, as it were, and to some inmate of the tower, in a voice not meant to be heard by those in the court, "Mysie, mysie, woman, stir for dear life, and get the fire mended. Take the auld 3-legged stool, or ony thing that's readiest, that will make a low. I doubt we are but poorly provided, no expecting ye this some months, when doubtless ye was hae been received conform to your rank, as good right is. But natheless—" "Natheless, Caleb," said the master, "we must have our horses put up, and ourselves too, the best we can. I hope you are not sorry to see me sooner than you expected." "Sorry, my lord? I am sure ye sall aye be my lord wi' honest folk, as your noble ancestors hae been these 300 years, and never asked a Whig's leave. Sorry to see the Lord of Ravenswood at ane of his ain castles." Then again apart to his unseen associate behind the screen, "Mysie,
Kill the brood hen without thinking twice on it. Let them care that come a hint. No to say it's our best dwelling," he added, turning to Bucklaw, "but just a strength for the Lord of Ravenswood to flee until, that is, no to flee, but to retreat until in troublous times, like the present, when it was ill convenient for him to live farther in the country, in ony of his better and mair principal manners. But for its antiquity, maist folk think that the outside of Wolf's Crag is worthy of a large perusal." "And you are determined we shall have time to make it?" said Ravenswood, somewhat amused with the shifts the old man used to detain them without doors until his confederate Mysie had made her preparations within. "Oh, never mind the outside of the house, my good friend," said Bucklaw; "let's see the inside, and let our horses see the stable, that's all." "Oh, yes, sir, ay, sir, unquestionably, sir. My lord and ony of his honourable companions—" "But our horses, my friend, our horses! They will be dead founded by standing here in the cold after riding hard, and mine is too good to be spoiled. Therefore, once more, our horses!" exclaimed Bucklaw. "True, ay, your horses, yes, I will call the grooms." And sturdily did Caleb roar, till the old tower rang again. "John! William! Saunders! The lads are gane out, or sleeping," he observed, after pausing for an answer, which he knew that he had no human chance of receiving. "A' gaes rang when the master's out by. But I'll take care of your cattle mysell." "I think you had better," said Ravenswood; "otherwise I see little chance of their being attended to at all." "Whisht, my lord, whisht, for God's sake," said Caleb, in an imploring tone, and apart to his master. "If ye dinna regard your ain credit, think on mine. We'll hae hard eneugh wark to make a decent night o't, wi' a' the lees I can tell." "Well, well, never mind," said his master; "go to the stable. There is hay and corn, I trust." "Ou, ay, plenty of hay and corn." This was uttered boldly and aloud, and in a lower tone. "There was some half foos o' aits, and some tets o' meadow hay, left after the burial." "Very well," said Ravenswood, taking the lamp from his domestic's unwilling hand; "I will show the stranger upstairs myself." "I canna think of that, my lord. If ye wad but have 5 minutes, or 10 minutes, or, at maist, a quarter of an hour's patience, and look at the fine moonlight prospect of the Bass and North Berwick Law, till I sort the horses, I would marshal ye up, as reason is ye should be marshalled, your lordship and your honourable visitor, and I hae lockit up the siller candlesticks, and the lamp is not fit." "It will do very well in the meantime," said Ravenswood, "and you will have no difficulty for want of light in the stable, for, if I recollect, half the roof is off." "Very true, my lord," replied the trusty adherent, and with ready wit instantly added, "and the lazy sclater loons have never come to put it on a' this while, your lordship." "If I were disposed to jest at the calamities of my house," said Ravenswood, as he led the way upstairs, "poor old Caleb would furnish me with ample means. His passion consists in representing things about our miserable menage, not as they are, but as, in his opinion, they ought to be; and, to say the truth, I have been often diverted with the poor wretch's expedients to supply what he thought was essential for the credit of the family, and his still more generous apologies for the want of those articles for which his ingenuity could discover no substitute. But though the tower is none of the largest, I shall have some trouble without him to find the apartment in which there is a fire." As he spoke thus, he opened the door of the hall. "Here, at least," he said, "there is neither hearth nor harbour." It was indeed a scene of desolation. A large vaulted room, the beams of which, combined like those of Westminster Hall, were rudely carved at the extremities, remained nearly in the situation in which it had been left after the entertainment at Allan Lord Ravenswood's funeral. Overturned pitchers and blackjacks, and pewter stoups and flagons, still cumbered the large oaken table. Glasses, those more perishable implements of conviviality, many of which had been voluntarily sacrificed by the guests in their enthusiastic pledges to favourite toasts, strewed the stone floor with their fragments,
As for the articles of plate, lent for the purpose by friends and kinsfolk, those had been carefully withdrawn so soon as the ostentatious display of festivity, equally unnecessary and strangely timed, had been made and ended. Nothing, in short, remained that indicated wealth. All the signs were those of recent wastefulness and present desolation. The black cloth hangings, which on the late mournful occasion replaced the tattered moth-eaten tapestries, had been partly pulled down, and dangling from the wall in irregular festoons, disclosed the rough stonework of the building, unsmoothed either by plaster or the chisel. The seats thrown down, or left in disorder, intimated the careless confusion which had concluded the mournful revel. "This room," said Ravenswood, holding up the lamp, "this room, Mr. Hayston, was riotous when it should have been sad. It is a just retribution that it should now be sad when it ought to be cheerful." They left this disconsolate apartment and went upstairs, where, after opening one or two doors in vain, Ravenswood led the way into a little matted anteroom, in which, to their great joy, they found a tolerably good fire, which Mysie, by some such expedient as Caleb had suggested, had supplied with a reasonable quantity of fuel. Glad at the heart to see more of comfort than the castle had yet seemed to offer, Bucklaw rubbed his hands heartily over the fire, and now listened with more complacency to the apologies which the Master of Ravenswood offered. "Comfort," he said, "I cannot provide for you, for I have it not for myself. It is long since these walls have known it, if indeed they were ever acquainted with it. Shelter and safety, I think, I can promise you." "Excellent matters, master," replied Bucklaw, "and with a mouthful of food and wine, positively all I can require tonight." "I fear," said the master, "your supper will be a poor one. I hear the matter in discussion betwixt Caleb and Mysie. Poor Balderstone is something deaf, among his other accomplishments, so that much of what he means should be spoken aside is overheard by the whole audience, and especially by those from whom he is most anxious to conceal his private manoeuvres. Hark!" They listened, and heard the old domestic's voice in conversation with Mysie, to the following effect: "Just mak the best o't, woman. It's easy to put a fair face on onything." "But the auld brood hen, she'll be as chach as bowstrings on bend leather." "Say ye made a mistake, Mysie," replied the faithful seneschal, in a soothing and undertoned voice. "Tak it on yoursell. Never let the credit of the house suffer." "But the brood hen," remonstrated Mysie, "oh, she's sitting some gate aneath the dice in the hall, and I am feared to gae in the dark for the bogle. And if I didna see the bogle, I could as ill see the hen, for it's pit mirk, and there's no another light in the house, save that very blessed lamp whilk the master has in his ain hand. And if I had the hen, she's to poo and to draw and to dress. How can I do that, and them sitting by the only fire we have?" "Weel, weel, Mysie," said the butler, "bide ye there a wee, and I'll try to get the lamp wiled away frae them." Accordingly, Caleb Balderstone entered the apartment, little aware that so much of his by-play had been audible there. "Well, Caleb, my old friend, is there any chance of supper?" said the Master of Ravenswood. "Chance of supper, your lordship!" said Caleb, with an emphasis of strong scorn at the implied doubt. "How should there be ony question of that, and us in your lordship's house? Chance of supper, indeed! But you'll no be for butcher meat. There's walthy fat poultry, ready either for spit or brander. The fat capon, Mysie," he added, calling out as boldly as if such a thing had been in existence. "Quite unnecessary," said Bucklaw, who deemed himself bound in courtesy to relieve some part of the anxious butler's perplexity. "If you have anything cold, or a morsel of bread—" "The best of bannocks!" exclaimed Caleb, much relieved; "and for cauld meat, a' that we hae is cauld eneugh. Howbeit, maist of the cauld meat and pastry was gien to the poor folk after the ceremony of interment, as good reason was. Nevertheless—" "Come, Caleb," said the Master of Ravenswood, "I must cut this matter short.
This is the young Laird of Bucklaw. He is under hiding, and therefore, you know—" "He'll be nae nicer than your lordship's honour, I'se warrant," answered Caleb cheerfully, with a nod of intelligence. "I am sorry that the gentleman is under distress, but I am blythe that he canna say muckle agin our housekeeping, for I believe his ain pinches may match ours. No that we are pinched, thank God," he added, retracting the admission which he had made in his first burst of joy; "but nae doubt we are waur aff than we hae been, or should be. And for eating, what signifies telling a lee? There's just the hinder end of the mutton ham that has been but 3 times on the table, and the nearer the bane the sweeter, as your honours weel ken, and there's the heel of the ewe milk kebbuck, wi' a bitty nice butter, and that's a' that's to trust to." And with great alacrity he produced his slender stock of provisions, and placed them with much formality upon a small round table betwixt the two gentlemen, who were not deterred either by the homely quality or limited quantity of the repast from doing it full justice. Caleb, in the meanwhile, waited on them with grave officiousness, as if anxious to make up, by his own respectful assiduity, for the want of all other attendance. But, alas! how little on such occasions can form, however anxiously and scrupulously observed, supply the lack of substantial fare. Bucklaw, who had eagerly eaten a considerable portion of the thrice-sacked mutton ham, now began to demand ale. "I wadna just presume to recommend our ale," said Caleb. "The mot was ill made, and there was awfu' thunner last week; but siccan water as the Tower well has, you'll seldom see, Bucklaw, and that I'se engaged for." "But if your ale is bad, you can let us have some wine," said Bucklaw, making a grimace at the mention of the pure element, which Caleb so earnestly recommended. "Wine!" answered Caleb undauntedly. "Eneugh of wine! It was but 2 days syne, wae's me for the cause, there was as much wine drunk in this house as would have floated a pinnace. There never was lack of wine at Wolf's Crag." "Do fetch us some then," said the master, "instead of talking about it." And Caleb boldly departed. Every expended butt in the old cellar did he set a tilt, and shake with the desperate expectation of collecting enough of the grounds of claret to fill the large pewter measure which he carried in his hand. Alas! each had been too devoutly drained, and with all the squeezing and manoeuvring which his craft as a butler suggested, he could only collect about half a quart that seemed presentable. Still, however, Caleb was too good a general to renounce the field without a stratagem to cover his retreat. He undauntedly threw down an empty flagon, as if he had stumbled at the entrance of the apartment, called upon Mysie to wipe up the wine that had never been spilt, and placing the other vessel on the table, hoped there was still enough left for their honours. There was indeed, for even Bucklaw, a sworn friend to the grape, found no encouragement to renew his first attack upon the vintage of Wolf's Crag, but contented himself, however reluctantly, with a draught of fair water. Arrangements were now made for his repose, and as the secret chamber was assigned for this purpose, it furnished Caleb with a first-rate and most plausible apology for all deficiencies of furniture, bedding, etc. "For wha," said he, "would have thought of the secret chamber being needed? It has not been used since the time of the Gowrie conspiracy, and I durst never let a woman ken of the entrance to it, or your honour will allow that it wad not hae been a secret chamber lang." Chapter 7.